Lavender Field, Sean speaking. The beds themselves are 2 foot by 4 foot, and they sit about 33 inches high. If you're looking at herbs, you're looking at about kind of 15 to 18. And then, yeah, so that's going to vary. Like lettuce, if you do from seed, if you're doing tomatoes are at a different time, that's more a summertime, whereas lettuce is for spring. So I don't. We weren't able to pull off yet. We'll have them for next year. The tomatoes and peppers. If I were you, I would wait because early May is just a better time for that stuff, and we'll have a good supply. On the stuff outside, cilantro, parsley, dill, fennel, chive, rosemary, oregano, thyme, sage, lavender. They give you the big berries that you're used to eating, and they fruit one time of year in the late spring, summer, and they'll likely bloom again in the fall, but not as heavy. The seascape is an ever bearer, so much smaller berries, but consistently all through the season, spring, summer, fall. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Strawberries. Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. Correct. Yeah. Okay. It's like oranges, yellows, and variegated, kind of orange yellows. A little bit of burgundy, but not a whole lot. Oh, same one. We've only got the one flavor of French marigold. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay, no problem. We've got lovage, which is a celery flavor. Looks like parsley. It's got a celery flavor. Yeah. I think you're good. Stick with what you've got, and then you'll see where to fill the gaps in and everything too if you want. I mean, I understand it's a ways, so I'm happy to kind of walk you through stuff when you get here too. It's just a little abstract, a little fun. Yeah, container gardening. Yeah, if you sign into your YouTube account, you can ask questions too in real time. So, yeah, tell Rob to sign up for it. Tell him not to be lazy. I'll think about it in between now and when you come out about that. I do, fresh off the press. Yeah, that's. I mean, to his point about suicides and stuff, I don't think that's too far stretch. Yeah. I guess that's not me, right? Someone else doing it. Is it Amra? Is it Amra? Since. If you work outside, so oh, actually, if you'll grab me a deck rail planter, please, Joey, and then the like the chef planter, that multi one out of there. you ever been able to talk to somebody?
Unfortunately, I don't. 11:59. Yeah, I'll take their name and number and give them a call back. Well, folks, 12 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to talk about container gardening, run through from start to finish, really how to get started if you've got a clean slate and just an idea of containers and what you think you might want to put in them and where you might want to put them, all the way up to if you already have containers or already container gardening. Just a few little points to cover. And usually what we try to start out with is what we're going to talk about are ideals. So when we talk about full sun is not imperative for the health of your plant, but the more sun you have, the happier your plants are going to be, the quicker they're going to grow. That usually equals less bug problems. It equals more produce for you. So again, full sun, though ideal, isn't a complete prerequisite. But when you dip below about 6 hours of sunlight, so on something like a mint, rosemary, thyme, oregano, sage, those take the lowest light out of all of the herb plants. So rosemary, thyme, oregano, sage, mint is another one you could put. They're a good place to start if you have a lot of shade or you don't have really a whole lot of direct sun for your plants, especially if you're just starting out. Don't want to get a whole bunch and invest a whole bunch of money in those lower light conditions, really not knowing what works and what doesn't. And it will not take the whole season to really figure that out. You'll know in about a month to 6 weeks on, how things are rolling, whether you're getting enough out of them to warrant, getting more. So again, kind of start just with a few if you're just starting out and you have that questionable sunlight. Now, if you have more, you have that 6 to 8 range is pretty good. The 8 to 10 is even better. And again, the 10 and more hours of sunlight a day is really what they want. That is a little odd. Obviously, no one wants to be out in the sun all day long kind of thing. So plants are the same. And if you can give them a little bit of afternoon relief in summertime, they do perk up a little bit, in the evening and look a little nicer and happier. But as far as what they want, how it specs out on paper and kind of the guidelines to look at, it really is the more sun, the happier and healthier the plant. And then, like I said before, the less problems that you're going to have, which makes it easier. Container gardening is kind of on the higher end of controlling almost everything. You get to determine the size of the container, what goes into it, how many plants, when to prune, when to take it out. And like I said, we'll get to all that kind of as we move through. And with container gardening, you pay for that. It's a little more expensive on the front end. You got to pay for the containers. You got to pay for the soil. The soil should last you years. It shouldn't be every year you throw it all out and start again. We'll cover that when we get to the soil preparation and the conditioning. But on the container side, again, it allows you to control more of the variables with the soil that you put in there, where it is in the sense of where you can put a container versus a bed. So if you're just starting out, container gardening is a really good way to get your feet wet with herb plants and with some vegetable plants as well, to see if you like it, and you're going to get that return on investment. And then sometimes it's just more so that you're restricted by the space. Maybe you've only got a small patio or a balcony. So the container gardening is a good way to get, to really use any available space that you have. So as we move through, we're going to talk about the type of container and the size. We're going to talk about what to put in it as far as the potting mix that we'll talk through and kind of the conditions there that you'll need. And then we'll talk about harvesting, when to harvest and what to harvest and so forth. And then when to replant. So to give you an idea of that, if you have yourself a container of any size, and let's say you're used to putting in some basil, some cilantro, maybe a rosemary or an oregano, and really just using it for kind of that April, May kind of time frame to get started with more of a summer kind of production. So that is more so you've got planting real estate. So how about we use that for spring crops? You can throw some lettuce in there right now. You can already have some kale and some spinach. You could have already had some kale and spinach in there growing. And then the nice thing with that is that carries you through into that earlier part of May when your basil is ready to go out. Maybe you've got a pepper or a chili in mind, and then you can put that in there as well. So again, on a container, try not to think of this is all it's used for. Try to think of it as a production facility, as a factory kind of thing. This is my planting real estate. How can I get the most out of it? Obviously, because then you get the most for your return on investment. So with that in mind, let's talk placement. Other than full sun, that's really what you want, but you also want convenience. You're paying a little more on the front end for the container garden versus just taking it and putting it in the yard, in the ground, and seeing what you get. So container gardening really should offer you a lot more convenience. The closer you have them to the house, the more apt I think it is that we use them. So with that in mind, on a patio table, if you've got them on your deck, it is a good idea to have some kind of thing to raise it up. That will aerate the roots a little bit. It'll keep the container from sitting on the deck and staining the deck. It'll also allow the water to drain out. So that's a nice kind of product to have, so that it doesn't stain your deck, and you don't know that until you've moved the container. But as far as where to put it, try to get it as convenient as you can. The more you see it, the more you'll know if you need to do something: watering, pruning, fertilizing, and all of that. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So size and amount. So how many containers? What should they be made of? What kind of size, should I be considering? The materials question is a little more personal. So plastic, you've got clay, you've got glazed. They all have their pros and cons. Plastic is cheaper. It'll last longer. It will discolor. It does kind of heat up the roots a little bit more, obviously, because it's not a natural material. So it's keeping that heat in the container and cooking the roots a little, not cooking, but it'll be warmer in that root area than it would if it was a clay pot. So clay is porous, allows a little bit more oxygen to the roots. It dries it out quicker, which does make the plants happier. And then it's usually about a little more expensive than a plastic container, and it'll crack over time. So you don't get the longevity out of terracotta that you would out of plastic. And then you've got glazed, which is even more expensive, a little more decorative though. Doesn't have as much of that aeration because it's glazed. Again, it's coated and sealed on the outside there, and usually on the inside too. So with that, it's just a little, that's kind of the middle ground. But again, that expense kind of thing is a nice jump up from your terracotta. So all things to consider. We have a mix of all of them for you at the farm. And really on the container, again, there's no kind of silver bullet. This is the one you should go with. We just kind of give you the facts and let you sort it out from there. As far as the different styles, so most of the different styles are in plastic. Your containers, your terracotta, your glazed are usually just your standard kind of look to them as well. So what kind of size? So it really depends on what you're looking to grow. We'll start with a mint plant. You can also think of a cilantro. You can also think of a basil. Any single herb plant. Usually about kind of 6 inches of space is what we're after. So this is an 8-inch pot. This is a nice kind of size. Anywhere from a 6 to 8 inch pot for one single herb plant is really what you're after. You step it up to the other end of the spectrum. If you're looking to grow a tomato in a container, really be thinking more like a 5-gallon bucket kind of size. It really needs about a square foot to 16 kind of inches square. The more depth you give it, the happier it's going to be, because it can go down as opposed to taking up more and more space seeking out. So, you don't have to have this big 30-inch container that's only 5 inches deep kind of thing. So about a 5-gallon bucket is kind of the size that you're after and should be thinking of for a full-size tomato. really, if you're looking at tomatoes, see if you can get away with a cherry tomato. Also, what's sometimes called a cocktail tomato. So it's kind of that mid-range. It's not a big beefsteak tomato. It's not a cherry tomato. It's kind of that middle ground of that nice kind of maybe 3 to 4 inch around kind of. So it still allows you to slice, and it's not a cherry. So kind of that middle ground. Those will yield a little more in a container of that size for a 5-gallon. Plus, the cherry tomatoes really yield so much too. So, again, that's kind of up to you. But if you're looking at a big full-size vegetable like that, really be thinking of a 5-gallon bucket. So, herb plants. The biggest thing I think to remember is they grow in tandem. So, on your herb plant, the roots will grow, your top growth will grow, and they will grow in tandem, where as the roots grow and the top grows and the roots grow and the top grow, that's kind of that's how the plant will grow and get larger. In a container, you're really not interested in a lot of root space. Once it's planted and it's growing and showing new growth, you're ready to cut on it immediately, and you really should be cutting on it. And the reason is the roots and the top growth growing in tandem. If you're always cutting on the top growth, like every week, let's say a mint plant, a rosemary, an oregano, a sage, a thyme, if you're always cutting on the top growth, it's just always putting out more fresh top growth instead of getting huge and your rosemary turning from that little 4 to 5 inch plant when you buy it into this 12 to 14 to 16 inch plant. So it kind of, the fork in the road is aesthetics versus flavor and use. If you're looking at it as an ornamental plant, you have at it, let it grow to whatever size you want. If you're looking at them for how can I get the most out of the herb plant that I've bought in the way of flavor and then the way of production, the smaller you keep them, the happier they're going to be. A container really is the epitome of keeping them small, not letting them get big, again, because all things are relative in the sense of when you buy a rosemary and you start clipping all those tips off the rosemary, you end up with quite a good amount of rosemary very, very quickly. And the plant really doesn't need to be that big for it to yield that. So you want to be mindful of when you put things in a container together that you're not letting them get big and overgrown because they get bitter. It's a lot more work as far as watering goes. Bugs love overgrown plants because there's this nice canopy of humidity for them. And shield from natural predators and so forth. So again, be mindful that these containers really are a production facility. If you're cutting on them, they're always producing, and the more often you're cutting on them, the fresher, tastier, and more vigorous the plant is, and healthier, the plant is going to be as well. So really good idea on any type of container that you have to bear in mind that you want to keep things cut and keep it producing for you. That's really, if you're on the flavor side, if you're on the I bought the herb for the flavor and the flavoring of my food side, then you're really after plants that produce. You're not so much interested in the look. They're never going to be ugly, but the plant that produces and gets cut and produces and gets cut obviously doesn't look as polished as the one that's just kind of left alone to grow. So how many and in what kind of style, and then what plants go together with other plants? So let's run through the different styles of container real quick, and then hopefully from there you can plug in kind of what you want. So again, a 6 to 8 inch, you're looking at one herb. Here we've got a 12 inch, so a nice big 12 inch container. You're looking at 3 to 4. That's probably about the most you want in there. General rule of garden design is plant in odd numbers. So that's up to you. Just throwing it out there as a tip, and that's what people will tell you. So when you plant 4 in there, you can say, I paid for it, so I did what I wanted. A 14 inch, you're looking at 5 plants kind of thing in there. And then that's really about as deep as you really need it for that size. There's really not a whole lot of point going to a 20, a 24 inch, mostly because it's an advantage to have a few containers versus one. And before we get into styles, let me clarify that real quick. So parsley, dill, fennel, basil, chives, there's one I'm forgetting, cilantro. Those are the leafy kind of plants. They are high water plants. So your cilantro, your basil, your dill, you're going to be watering them not every day, but you're going to be watering them fairly regularly as compared to an oregano or a thyme or a sage or a lavender. And those are your woody kind of perennials, whereas the other ones are more your leafy kind of annuals and biennials. So it is better if you have like a 10 to 12 to 14 inch container that you can kind of group those together and then have a separate container of the ones that are going to want to dry out. So to give you an idea, this size container, so your 12-inch container, if you put an oregano in there, a thyme, a sage, and let's say a rosemary, that container left outside, you're really going to have to water that maybe every other week if it's not getting rain once they're established in that container. Whereas your cilantro, your basil, your dill, they're going to need watering probably once a week, depending on kind of the size and how often you're cutting on them. But it's just easier on you, much healthier for the plant, that you're not watering everything because the basil needs water, or you're not watering everything because the cilantro, looks dry. So again, breaking them up is a little easier if you can group things together. If you don't have the luxury of space or multiple containers, putting them in one is fine. If you had your basil in here and your rosemary over here, and your basil needed water, it would be just a good idea to water the basil instead of watering everything. Watering is probably the most often asked question. And for those who are tuning in of our regulars, I'm going to bore you with the details yet again, because watering is probably the key, one of the biggest keys to success. If you've got full sun, really the watering is the next big thing. And then the container, fill the soil is probably the only other thing to bear in mind to set up from the beginning. So watering is, the plant is dry on top. The plant looks like it's dry. And I dig down in the container. So in these little containers, you get to pop it out and kind of take a look. When it's planted, you obviously don't want to be taking it out all the time, but you will dig down kind of a little bit beside or around and just make sure it's dry all the way down. So the top looks dry very quickly. The wind will be just as much to blame as the sun to dry out your plant. But really what you want to be paying attention to is once it's established in that container, and the roots are to the bottom, you want to make sure it's drying out all the way down, which takes a bit of doing to be sure that you're just not keeping that plant wet. The more often that you water it, the plant itself, it might not kill it. It is the quickest way to kill herbs, is to overwater them. While it might not kill it, the plant really doesn't thrive because it's not worked. If it thinks it's dry and it's drying out and it's not going to get any more water, it's going to root out. It's going to come across those nutrients in the container and grow you a healthier plant quicker. So the best way is to refrain from watering. When you do water very well and let it dry right back out again. So back to the plants and the containers kind of thing, but just a quick note on the watering, because again, it's quite important. The different styles that we have. So you can get a deck rail. So it sits on a small kind of width and a larger width. Give you a deck rail, and you usually put about five herb plants in there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry, a little difficult with the camera. But nice thing with that is it's very close to the house, usually, right by your grill. You're cutting on it, walking back inside. It's very, very quick and efficient. A nice way to grow it, usually kind of a sunny spot too. Another style we have is the multi-sectional planter. So this allows you 9 plants, 8 little pockets. Your basil usually goes in the top because it's got a good amount of room. It is hollow in the middle, so it's not a whole lot of soil, but about a cubic foot bag fills it up. So that one's nice because it's got 9 spots. It's all in the same container, but yet it's separated. Easy to visualize and then also care for. When you water, you're watering each one as opposed to watering the whole thing. None of these are self-watering. The self-watering containers have a reservoir at the bottom. It's got a little grate in there with a reservoir at the bottom. You fill that with water. Some things actually work okay. Sometimes your basils, your parsley, your cilantro, your mints, those kind of things pull it off, and you really don't notice a whole lot of difference to a non-self-watering container. But if it's always wet and those roots are always sitting in water, and the plant itself, those roots will start to rot and kill off the plant if it's not dealing as well, especially if the soil in there is very, very heavy to begin with. So it brings us to the next point of what to fill the container with. You want a good quality potting mix. What we use is what we sell in the bags. So that's the bag there itself. The potting mix is really light and fluffy. And that's really what you're after. It doesn't have to be that exact brand, but when you go buy it, make sure when you pick it up, it's very, very light. Nice, light, fluffy kind of structure. Give you an idea. The soil itself takes a bit to wet it first time, but then it obviously will repel that water because it can't hold too much, because it's not a potting soil. So the potting mixes are vermiculite, perlite, peat moss, pine bark, cocoa hulls. There are a whole bunch of ingredients put together really just to fill the void in the container to house your plant and facilitate the transfer of nutrients and the water, to have the plant take the sunlight and turn it into leaves. That's really all the soil does, all the potting mix does, and that in itself is the potting mixes are usually more expensive than potting soils. Potting soils are usually dirt and mulch and compost in varying degrees and mixed together, which works well for like a perennial, hardy perennial that's going to get planted outside, trees, shrubs, that kind of thing. But things like an herb, a vegetable, even your flowers are really going to thrive. Like all plants thrive on drainage. But these ones in particular, because they usually stay smaller, I'm talking about the herbs more so now, the quicker that they dry out, the happier and healthier they're going to be. So from completely wet to completely dry, and then you water, and then back to dry. So the quicker that cycle happens, the happier they're going to be. And that potting mix really facilitates that very good. So bad news is it's more work for you, but the excellent upside is that it's much, much healthier plants. So overwatering isn't as much of an issue with a potting mix versus a potting soil. And you'll notice when you get drainage into a container, whether it be a container or a raised bed, anytime you can get drainage into that soil, your plants will respond usually, because on that side of it, if there's drainage, things dry out quicker, the plant gets exercised more, and it wants to work, and it wants to put out more fresh foliage for you. So the potting mix is pretty essential on that side. The fertilizer would be next. So a little bit of a different spectrum. Herbs don't need a whole lot. Vegetables need a good amount, and then flowers kind of even more so. So we have a fish and seaweed. This has actually got mint oil in it, so it's a minty fresh seafood smell. So fish and seaweed, it's a very weak, low-dose fertilizer. It's got a little dosing cap. You're only going to use about a tablespoon per gallon. And for a perennial, like a rosemary, thyme, sage, oregano kind of arrangement in a container, you're looking at a tablespoon per gallon once a month. Other things like your basil, if you let them get a little larger or you're cutting on them very, very frequently, you may notice you need that a little more often, but it's still best to stick to once a month and see how it goes to begin with. Your parsley is going to be a really good canary. So the parsley, if there's a lot of yellowing on the leaves, and for those of you out there, I know this is cilantro, so I'm just assuming you see it as parsley to show you the illustration. So nice green leaves, and that's really what you're after. On the bottom here, if you've got yellowing leaves down the bottom, or you've got some yellowing leaves around the outside, just those older leaves, that's not very alarming. It's if you've got predominantly yellow leaves, then it's usually a sign of a lack of nitrogen, lack of nutrients, and you'll go ahead and you'll hit it with the fish and seaweed. Or maybe it's a nice reminder that we forgot to fertilize that month, and we'll go ahead and it'll green back up pretty quickly. So parsley is just a good one to keep an eye on for that reason, because if your parsley's yellowing, your other plants will follow. That's really the first one to go. So the fertilizer is important because that's really what converts the plant, gives the plant that ability to make that oil, which is the flavor. So what I mean by that is a mint plant that's uncared for in a container left out year after year after year after year, and not pruned or anything, just left there kind of thing, it will still taste like mint as you taste the leaf. But as soon as you taste it and your brain and your palate recognize that it's mint, that flavor kind of leaves. Whereas one that's pruned as well as fertilized and watered and cared for, that flavor will linger like it should. A container is a closed system, so it's not going to put out what you don't put in. So with that in mind, the sunlight, we're watering, the fertilization is kind of the other key. The finer line on the fertilizing is if you over fertilize, you're going to have a beautiful, gorgeous plant, but it's just not really going to taste as pungent as it should because all of that fertilization, all of that feeding has pushed that plant to grow foliage, but not really set the flavor. If it's a vegetable like a tomato, it's going to grow a whole lot, but not put out a whole lot of fruit. So do be mindful. They do need some fertilizer, but really not a whole lot. Now to clear up on the vegetable side, so in a container for a tomato, let's say that 5-gallon bucket, you're better off using a granular. We have a tomato tone, a Spoma brand tomato tone. So that's better to kind of figure out how much of that area on the dirt, as compared to the directions on the back there to how much to use. But a granular fertilizer is a little stronger. It's going to be quite a lot stronger than the fish and seaweed. The fish and seaweed's just a little something to keep the herb plants going because they really don't like a whole lot. If you were to plant the herb in the garden, it really doesn't need anything. Whereas in a container, again, being a closed system in that potting mix, that's when you want to be mindful to feed it every now and then. To answer the question on potting mix that already has the food in there. Because we do herbs and vegetables and we treat them differently, really your potting mix should as well. A whole bunch of food for herb plants, again, is going to lead to nice growth, but not the pungency of flavor. And they're usually not geared for this and that and that and this and that and all the rest of it. There's kind of a blanket, one-size-fits-all kind of arrangement to that feeding and potting mix kind of together. So again, the potting mix that we have has just a really a small amount to begin with, and then you're adding into there. That's a nicer way to do it because you get to control. So if you end up using it for herbs, you feed it for herbs. If you use it for a vegetable, you feed it for a vegetable. One other question while I think of it, we do get quite a lot. So a nice big container like this and even bigger, do I have to fill the whole thing with potting mix? Kind of depends on what you're putting in there. Again, full-size vegetable, yes. Cilantro, basil, no, not really. You can put a false bottom in there. Some folks will put empty water bottles in there. We get the question on gravel and rock and all the rest of it. In filling a container, it's best on the potting mix we've found to stick to just the potting mix. The rock in the bottom, if it's for drainage kind of thing, is one thing. If you're looking to save some space, it's usually better. They sell little plant caddies that you can like put a false bottom down in there. It's usually better to go that route because, again, it's not taking up that space, and then you're not using all of that container for root growth and development anyway, so you don't have to spend all that money on filling the whole thing with potting mix. But really, when you have that potting mix, it's usually not a good idea to start adding different things here and there, again, because it'll throw that balance out of the drainage and water retention. So to give you an idea, once that, so when we plant these for the very first time, we will water it to the point that the soil is drenched with water. And as we water, the water is just running through because the soil can't hold any more water. So the nice thing with that is once it's wet all the way through, the soil is consistently wet top to bottom. So you don't get these pockets of dry soil that will later then continue to be pockets of dry soil that repel and they don't handle the root growth as well. Got a question from Marilyn. Tips for repelling rabbits, squirrels, etc. We have had in the past it's a natural repellent. So I think the deer one smells like rotten eggs, and it stunk like rotten eggs. So if you're okay with that around the house, I'd love to know how that went. They have a rabbit. It's called I Must Garden. They have a rabbit and a squirrel one as well that works on scents. What we've found with that is it's all things in balance. If I'm a hungry rabbit and I've got to hold my nose as I eat, I'm probably just going to go ahead and eat. Depends on the time of year, depends on what's available around as well. One thing for rabbits especially is if you have an old hanging basket, so the wire frame with the cocoa fiber in it, or something similar, maybe you can make a cage out of that rat wire or chicken wire, that really kind of 1/4-inch square or 1/2-inch square roll that's sold in the fencing department at your hardware stores. And you can kind of make a dome. So that old hanging basket upside down, it might not protect all of your foliage, but it's going to protect most of it and the crown as well. So it'll keep them away a little bit. The only other thing really on rabbits and squirrels is fencing. I mean, if you know you've got a problem and it's just going to drive you crazy, it's better off to spend a little bit more money and time and set it up to where they can't get at it. And then it'll taste even better because you'll be eating it all as well. So sorry, Marilyn, it's not a complete answer, but that's kind of the tips that we've found over the years that might work for you. Okay, so harvesting and then when to replant. We'll wrap up in just a couple of minutes. So harvesting is often. The more often you cut on them, again, the more often they're putting out fresh growth for you. Think of a parsley. If you let your parsley plant get too big, it ends up looking like celery. So you want to be mindful that that's more work for you for less reward, because it's going to taste bitter, it's going to need more water, and it's going to look uglier if you don't water it. So keep it cut, keep it short, and keep it productive. That'll keep it flavorful. That'll keep the bugs away, and that'll keep you interested because you'll be out there cutting on it and enjoying it and using it. When to replant. So when things peter out, a basil plant in August, once it tops out at a consistent 90 degrees, the growth curve of a basil really kind of drops off and it really kind of tends to shut down. So giving it some afternoon shade, moving it into that area would be a good idea. Not sacrificing all of that afternoon though. Like you're looking at maybe like lunchtime, 2 o'clock kind of time frame onwards. Again, if you don't have the luxury of I don't get any sun in the morning and it's all afternoon, then you just leave it out. But the more often you cut on it and keep it small, the happier that plant's going to be. When to replant. So if you're looking at your tomato container, your 5-gallon bucket, obviously once that tomato starts to shut down, kind of late September, early October, it's a good idea to get rid of that tomato plant out of there. Maybe throw in a little bit of mushroom compost into that bucket, or a little bit of fresh potting mix, kind of mix it up a little bit, get it aerated. And that would be a good idea to put some kale or some chard or some spinach, and that'll get you through Thanksgiving into December. And then it'll perk back up next year as February gives way to March, and you'll have it for March, April, and into May. So again, think of a container like planting real estate. The more often you're using it and working it, the happier and healthier those plants are going to be. So I think that just about answers it. I'll give it another few moments for any other questions. As far as the container gardening, again, just to reiterate, it does allow you to set up pretty quickly, be off and running almost immediately. And then when you've got a clean slate or you're adding containers, really think about what's going to benefit you. If you've always wanted to do herbs and you're just getting started, think of the herb plants that you already use and eat in your cooking and go ahead and grow some of those. The more attractive it is to begin with, the easier it is to transition into cooking with it and using it. And then the more apt it is to be able to be rewarding where you can invest more in it. So basil is obviously a popular one. Parsley is a really easy one. And again, those don't have too many problems in growing with the full sun and the drainage, and again, not overwatering. So hopefully that helps. We will be, next one is aha moments, which is Thursday at 7 p.m. So this one's going to be those gardening moments where we've been doing the same thing over and over, and we figured out that wasn't the right thing to do, and it was so obvious and easy. We're like, really should have seen that coming. So we share a couple with those. We've got a couple on Saturday morning as well. You can keep up to date. Facebook, I think you do the buttons or stuff down here to let you know. And then our newsletter as well. Plant availability is online. Hopefully that's been a help, and let us know, and look forward to helping you enjoy your garden. Take care, folks.